morning, everyone, and welcome to Tortoise's Future of Money Summit. We're living through an age where things are changing at an accelerating and some suggest an irreversible rate. We are seeing a massive move towards online transactions, an unparalleled increase in government borrowing, and an absolutely mind-boggling spike in the value of Bitcoin. All of these things suggest that we may be witnessing the beginnings of a fundamental change in what we understand to be money. And in the course of today, we at Tortoise want to do what we built Tortoise to do, which was not try and break every single new thread of news, but try and understand what's driving the news, trying to pull those threads together and get a better understanding of how our world works. We have a series of conversations through the course of the day. They're all modeled on our central premise, which is the thinking, the idea that our newsroom should be open and that you all should participate, sharing your views, experience, expertise. Please do weigh in the chat. You'll see my colleague Liz Mosley is here in this first conversation. You're going to see Liz trying to marshal the conversation, and I'm going to hand over to her at 9 for the conversation that begins on digital currencies. Please do weigh in, and I'll try and bring you in as well. All of it is going to feed in through the course of the day to a readout that we as editors will provide at the end of the day at the summit. And for the first time today, we're going to go at 6 London time to a clubhouse conversation to try and digest what we've heard and produce the findings of our think-ins on the future of money. So please do stick with us for some, all of the day, and please feel free to join us later. I'm delighted that we start with Anne Cairns. Anne has one of those absolutely mind-boggling CVs, and Liz, I know, is going to raise in the chat. The reason, Anne, is that the thing that's brilliant about talking to you is that we could actually talk about so many things completely unrelated to money. We could talk about engineering, we could talk about our energy future, we could talk about, the civil service, but we're going to try and keep it, if we might, Anne, to money. And I suppose, given your position at Mastercard, given the way in which Mastercard itself changed our understanding of money and understanding of payments, I wondered whether or not you could start by answering the question I posed at the beginning. When you think about digital transactions, government debt, the rise of cryptocurrency, do you think these things add up to a different future of money?
Well, I do, James, because first of all, is it different or is it just accelerating? Mm-hmm. If we look back to last year and see what happened during the pandemic, at Mastercard, we saw a spike in digital payments that was bigger than anything we'd seen in the last 5 years. So there was a massive, massive transition to that last year. And I don't think it's any surprise to anyone on the line that, there's an incredible increase in e-commerce because people are just ordering lots of goods online. I'm sure you are, I know I am. But beyond that, when we go out into the street and we go and buy our local groceries or our coffee, we're just tapping our cards or our telephones to pay for these. And it's a persistent trend. Something like 8 out of 10 transactions across Europe now are completely digital. But apart from that, people are wanting choice in payments. They don't want, well, first of all, people don't wake up in the morning and say, I think I'll make a payment. I mean, if you're me, you're probably waking up thinking, I'll buy a pair of shoes. Maybe not these days, maybe flip-flops these days. But the thing is, you're going to do something, you're transacting, and people are expecting that to be safe, secure, easy, and to happen in any way that they want. And it's a bit like, I would equate it to London transport, that there's so many different ways you could move across London, whether it's tube, bus, train, Uber, taxi, and all are available to you. And sometimes you just mix and match what you're doing to fit into your environment. And we call that contextual commerce, because you want some big words to describe something. But even things like paying using your voice. voice activated is estimated to hit $40 billion by 2022. So it's really moved.
How much did you say, Anne?
$40 billion by 2022. Yeah.
And do you, I'd like to get into a bit what that means for an organization like yours, but I just also like to understand how you read what's happening in terms of human behavior. So when I grew up, and you still see it, particularly amongst, I would say, men of a certain age, that their relationship with money was with cash. You could actually feel it in their hands. Now you're talking about a relationship with money that is almost anything but cash. In fact, wealth and disposable income is mostly by those people who don't have it, whether it's on their phones or on their cards or Oyster cards. Or do you think that our understanding of money is changing, and who does this benefit and who does it risk?
Yes, I think I think our understanding is changing, and I think people are becoming much more comfortable with the idea of money being digital, which is probably something that has fueled consumers going into things like Bitcoin, because, as you know, Bitcoin is just mathematical calculations, basically. And the sort of, I don't know, Bond idea of somebody called Satoshi Nakamoto creating this thing out of nothing can be very appealing to people. But of course, it's developing into a big asset class now. And it's causing concern for some of the big central bankers. Janet Yellen was talking about it this week, saying, she's worried about people investing in it because it's risky. Having said that, as you point out, it's had a meteoric rise. So yeah, people's relationship with it is very different.
So we're going to, there are two elements here that you're talking about. There's technology as the enabler of the transfer, and there's payment systems divorcing from banks. The idea that you can be doing these things on apps, but the apps themselves are not necessarily backed by bank deposits and the normal, the old system of financial transactions. What's the implication of that, Anne? What happens when people are doing what they think of as banking, but not through banks?
Well, you're describing something that's called open banking, and this is actually happening all over the world today. Britain's one of the fastest movers in this space. And it is conceivable, well, it happens today, but it's conceivable it will happen more in the future, that people will become more comfortable with using a technological interface, which isn't their bank, to basically access their money, to move their money around. I mean, they already do it today, but the question is, are the banks going to move further back in the value chain and you never actually contact your bank? Well, I'm not sure about that because, going back to who we are, I actually like to know that my money's with the bank and it's actually protected. And providing that the banks come out and develop good technology and I can reach them easily and just open my, bank account with my face, for example, then I'm comfortable with that. But yes, this is open banking. It's happening everywhere. And sometimes people have money in lots of different places, and you can see the utility of being able to have an app that just called everything and pulled it all together for you and actually presented other information with it. What did you actually buy with it? Is your aeroplane ticket there? Let's hope we can fly at some point in the future. All of these things start to be accessible to the consumer, and people love it because the power of your own information in your own hands. But having said that, you need to protect people and you need to be able to make sure their information is protected and it's under their control and it's private and it's secure. And these things actually aren't true today.
So I had an interesting conversation a few months ago with Tim Steiner, the boss of Ocado, about exactly what you started off by saying, not that there's a structural change, but that there's an acceleration of an existing trend. It wasn't as though the pandemic invented online grocery shopping. It just rapidly accelerated the number of people using it. But his point was there's a tipping point. At a certain point, the economics of the bricks and mortar supermarkets changes fundamentally. and it's no longer economic, and therefore online grocery shopping suddenly accelerates even more. And I wonder, when you think about digital transactions, whether or not there's a tipping point there too, whether or not we, at some point, it becomes the case not only that all merchants start taking digital payments, but more and more stop taking cash, and actually you begin to see cash squeezed out of the economy. And I wonder what you think the likelihood of that is and the implications of it.
It's absolutely a tipping point, and we've already passed that in the UK a few years ago. You know, we are largely digital today. The same up in Scandinavia. I mean, cash has become a really rare thing. And what it's done is it's created questions, and this is to your point about fairness, about what about people who don't have access to digital? What should we do about them? And particularly during the pandemic, because, you know, about, 1 billion people have actually received payments from their own governments, for example, during the pandemic. And if you were only able to receive cash, then you'd be kind of queuing up at the post office in the UK. So how do you avoid that? Now, you might think the UK wouldn't have a problem with that, but there are about 1.3 million people in the UK who are unbanked. There are something like almost 12 million that are underserved, and they don't really have good access to the internet and so on. So that's when the infrastructure of the country has to kick in, and you have to create something that doesn't leave people behind if you're moving in that direction. And I think it's up to the government and the banking system, and I know that we're working with foundations like the Roundtree's Foundation to address exactly this issue. So, of course, that's the scale in Britain. Of course, when you look around the world, it's massive.
Exactly. And could we get into that, in the questions of fairness and the future of money, right? I see that both William McDonald has raised this in terms of, you know, your exclusion point, Anne, and Paul Atherton raised it in terms of privacy and security around cash. And I'm going to bring them both in. As we just get William first, I just want to double check something. Do we know who that 1.3 million unbanked are? Is it a particular age group? Is it a particular geography, community? How much do we know about that 1.3 million? It's a lot of people.
It is a lot of people, and they're spread throughout the country, and they're spread throughout the age groups as well. Although, as you point out, it's basically socioeconomic. It's lower income.
Right. All right. So can I bring in William McDonald first? William, you were making a point about inclusion, which I think Anne sort of tipped into as you were writing your comment in the chat. I just wondered what your thinking was on this.
Yeah, no, I was just very interested in your views on financial exclusion, and obviously it's the rising in digital and cashless is great for many people, but does it make, you know, cash is more tangible, so for some people does a cashless society actually make it a little bit harder to manage their finances, as well as I think the point you touched on about the people who are simply unbanked?
Well, I think a totally cashless society does, and it's got to be addressed. And apart from people in the lower socioeconomic groups, you've also got migrant workers. And I think, you know, different solutions are being developed around the world for this. You see the rise of the QR codes across the emerging markets. We've committed as a company to bring 1 billion people into the financial system. We've actually brought 500 million in the last 5 years. But of course, we also recognize that people need choice. And it's not our idea that you would drive out cash completely, because you do need to give people choice and all sorts of ways to actually live their lives. And I think that when you're actually designing a system and running a central bank and things like this, I know that that's the way that the central bankers think, even though 86% of them around the world are looking at digital cash. And the reason they're doing that is because of the thing that James mentioned about cost and utility and the tipping point that it causes of having something which is so efficient that, you know, it just allows you to run the economy in a very good way. And of course, it gets rid of illicit things, and it also gets rid of, you know, tax evasion and things like that.
William, thank you. I want to just also bring in Paul Atherton, if I might, because Paul, I think, Paul, you're going to make a point about cash and privacy.
Yeah, James, I think this has been kind of one of the driving things that I talked about sort of over the last couple of years, is that once you lose cash, you lose all privacy. So obviously all your data on credit cards and everything else is shareable. People can access that information. But when you have cash, you have complete autonomy over what you spend it on, how you spend it. And I think one of the critical things for me, obviously I spend a lot of time talking about welfare and homelessness and these kind of things. So the digital exclusion of that group of people is absolutely key to having cash, because without cash, you just can't function. But one of the interesting things here in Marylebone is that actually the higher end that you go, the easier it is to spend cash. So the sort of local shops and everything here, if they're low end, nearly everybody will refuse to take cash during the pandemic. But as soon as you start reaching up to the sort of high end hotels and that kind of ilk, they're all very happy to take cash. And again, it creates this exclusion between the poor and the rich.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Paul, but, you know, one of the examples that I use is if I go to see my mother in Newcastle and I pop to King's Cross and I buy myself a ticket on the day using cash, it will cost me like 120 quid. But if I actually go online and I buy that ticket a week in advance or something, it costs me 44. Yeah. So, you know, people are penalized for using cash. By the way, I'm not anti-cash. Mastercard runs the link system, which are all the ATMs in Britain. but I take the point.
But I think that's a really important point. Again, this is about sort of obviously supply and demand. If you're going to the station on the day, there is no demand for that seat. And under normal economics, that seat would almost be free. Whereas now we've created a society where we say when the demand is highest, when the tickets are cheapest, we've kind of inverted the whole way we do economics into that kind of system.
Well, thank you, and I do want to ask you this, Anne, because you know there's a good deal of concern now around what people call the K-shaped economy, you know, the K-shaped recovery, the idea that, you know, it won't be a W, it won't be a bounce, it won't be a V, but it'll be K-shaped. You know, the people who have will do better, and the people who have not will do worse. And I wonder whether the acceleration of digital money actually only amplifies that gap, because those people who have access to tech, access to good connectivity, and and essentially a range of different financial services will benefit from tech, and those people who don't won't.
Well, I think there might be something in that, James, because I do think access to financial services is critical, and we see it in an extreme way with respect to women around the world. And they're saying that across the globe, we're losing 172 trillion due to the difference between the lifetime earnings of women and men. And we know that women, although they control over 200 trillion of the world's wealth today, and they're probably going to control half of it in the next few years, only 65% of them have access to financial services. So we're talking about 35% of women, half the world's populations, not really having the benefit of full access to financial services. And it does create a subclass. And unfortunately, it's a subclass of half the human race. So that's a very real thing. And it's something that I think everybody who's sort of thinking about gender equality is aware of and saying we have to change this. This can't continue.
And is this and Anne, is that linked? Those numbers are amazing. Is that linked to the prosperity or the development of the economy? So if you look at female participation in the economy and banking systems, I'm imagining it varies significantly country to country.
It does, and I mean, if you looked at it in terms of what the gap is between men's wages and women's wages in a country, you'd see that sort of America, women are earning about 65% the amount that men do. It's about 60% in China, so it's somewhat equivalent. If you move to somewhere like Bangladesh, it's 40%. If you move to India, it's 20%. So it's a massive difference. And I'm imagining that Britain, I don't have the number in my mind, but I think it's probably similar to America.
I mean, and we should say, you know, we could have spent this half hour talking about the Hampton-Alexander Review, because this is for those people who don't know, the Hampton-Alexander Review was driving the change in representation of women in boardrooms across the FTSE 350. But let's just have a quick moment, though, just to talk about that. What's your read on what's been achieved?
Well, I think that we have made fantastic progress at the board level. I mean, we've moved from less than 10% women on boards about 11 years ago to 36% in the FTSE 100 and about 34% overall in the 350. So, and it's actually been driven by men, James, because men were at the top of the companies and they were the chairs of boards. And they became members of the 30% club and said, we're going to change things around here because we recognize it's important for the sustainability of our businesses. It's not just the right thing to do, there's a business rationale. Where we haven't really made so much progress, and I've said this in the press, is actually at the senior level within the company, the kind of level that I'm at, that sits at the very top of the company in the boardroom of the company, the ExCo, the executive committee, and there we're only just a little bit over 22%. And that's because we haven't really developed the pipeline of women coming up through business. And even our board, even all the things we've done on boards, Britain is one of the leading countries in the world. If you look across at Brazil, it's about 8%. It's maybe about 2% Middle East and Africa. Japan's recently moved from 7% to about 13%. They're in the 30% club. So there's a massive way to go in many different places in the world.
And can I just ask you, this issue about the ExCo, the executives on boards rather than the non-executives on boards, some people say, well, you know, obviously massively welcome the change and also the pace of it, but say, look, there's an opportunity on boards because there's an inevitable churn. Non-executives only serve a certain term and then you have to appoint someone new. So it really has been in the hands of those chairs to make the change. With executive teams, there's not a natural churn. People have jobs. You have to actually move them or sideline them, you know, in order to make space for new people. And what's your lesson from the 30% club for transforming or addressing that gap between non-executives at the senior leadership and executives at senior leadership?
Well, first of all, I think that you have to start lower down in the pipeline. There's a lot of research showing that women actually fall behind on the first step into the management ladder. And that's kind of in their 30s. And then there's this mystique about, oh, maybe that happened because a lot of them actually left and had children. We looked at that in our own company, Mastercard, and said, is that true? And we saw that men were accelerating a bit at that stage, and women were actually having a higher attrition rate. So we put in a mentorship program across the company for women, had like 800 people involved. So quite a good spread around the world. And we've done that for a year. And what we found is we've reduced that attrition rate massively this year. But not just that the performance ratings of the women have gone up. And so actually, and it's not that, you know, they were leaving to have children. So it's really interesting when you dig into it, that there's areas you have to fix that narrow the funnel to the top earlier. Right. In the cycle, just like you have to fix girls going into STEM subjects. You have to talk to them when they're like 12-year-old at school and say, don't drop all your science subjects and your maths and so on. Stick with it because you can have a really cool career in tech, which is something else. Yeah.
And we've had conversations. In fact, we've got to think in a week or so's time about Black, Asian, minority ethnic representation at the top of British companies. We had a thinking a few weeks ago about disability at the top of British businesses. What's the read across from the Hampton-Alexander Review about female representation at the top for disabled and Black, Asian, minority ethnic participation? And forgive me, I'm just going to move.
All right, I've got a dog too, but she's locked out. She went mad in a board meeting the other day because men came to my window to clean it. Anyway, I think there is a massive readout across the different groups. And at the 30% club, we actually said last year that we were going to request that the CEOs and the chairs signed up to have at least one person of colour on every board. And by the way, because we're the 30% club, we'd like 50% of those seats to go to women. Nobody pushed back on the one person of colour. A few CEOs said, Anne, are you serious? Could we have 50% women? And I said, well, actually, you're tracking at 42% today. So, you know, I'm a big data freak. I think it makes people feel comfortable that they can achieve targets. And I think the same with disability. You need to be able to measure these things and to report on them. I think I was at a think-in of yours in person a couple of years ago where I wasn't sure about that. But when I looked at your data, it was so stark on the disability side what was happening. It became really clear to me that it had to be measured, and you have to have goals around it. You have to be aware of it to be able to change it. In the 30% club, we have a big mentorship scheme. It's cross-country. It's across the country, and it's across industries. And there's about 2,500 people, women involved in the women's part of it. But now we've just launched Mission Include that covers ethnicity intersections, that covers disability, and all these things are intersectional, by the way, because, you know, kind of half the world are men, half are women. So you can be addressing many things at once.
I'm really interested, and by the way, I'm really interested. I remember so well having that conversation with you in our newsroom, and at the time, that sense, just even listening to you, that sense of, yes, I think that might be right, but I don't know yet. And it's amazing, isn't it, how data, or seeing the data, or even seeing the lack of it, can actually begin to change your mind.
Absolutely. Changed my mind in an hour, James. Yeah. Well, less than an hour when I saw the data, but yeah.
I want to just in the last couple of minutes and come to the conversation we're about to have, that my colleague and fellow editor Liz Mosley is about to chat on digital currencies. Because one of the things that intrigues me about what Mastercard is doing is that I understand you are beginning to open up to cryptocurrencies, but you're not opening up to Bitcoin. So will you just explain your thinking on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, by the way, today you can use your Mastercard to buy all sorts of cryptocurrencies. But the difference tomorrow is that we'll be moving cryptocurrencies across our network and not converting into fiat. And we're going to go
being like sterling or being like pounds or dollars.
Yes, exactly. And we're going to go into stable coins. And actually, we're working with many central banks around the world to look at things like digitizing the pound, digitizing different currencies around the world. The reason we're not going into Bitcoin is Bitcoin doesn't behave like a payment instrument. I mean, you might have read that it behaves more like gold. So it's too volatile and it takes too long to transact. So if you and I went for a cup of coffee and, I decided to pay with Bitcoin, I mean, our coffee might cost me, I don't know, 40% more by the time it was served. And it takes 10 minutes to actually settle the transaction. So it'll be cold by the time that I paid for it. And it just doesn't work that way. And of course, it might be, thinking of it like gold is the right way to think of it, because it's more of an asset class than a payment instrument.
But and just what's the principle on anonymity? Paul Atherton was making the point about cash and privacy. Bitcoin, of course, there's a register, but you don't have to give your real name. If you're using a stable coin, a cryptocurrency on the Mastercard network, do I have to give my identity, or is there a means of protecting my privacy?
Well, look, I mean, there is means of protecting your own privacy in the sense that privacy is in your own hands and it's locked with your own passwords and information's encrypted. So it's not that easy for someone to come along and see exactly what you're doing. But yes, the data is there. It's different from absolute anonymity for sure. Now, the interesting thing is, if you think about it, say during furlough and so on, if you were using the traditional system and things are being counted, you're much more likely to get support from the government when you actually need it. Right. If you've been doing a lot of things that are actually invisible to the government, then you're probably not getting the help that you need during the pandemic.
And thank you. Even as we're talking, I can see that we've left so many questions unasked. There's questions about that, the strength of Mastercard, the implications for other new entrants into the payments industry. There's questions about whether or not Mastercard will accept Tether and the future of stable coins. There's a whole bunch of those things. Unfortunately, the time seems to have just rattled past us, and it's my job now just to thank you. I hope you'll stay with us and stick around for a while if you can.
Absolutely. I want to hear what Hugh says on crypto.
So I'm going to hand over right now to my colleague, Liz Mosley. But Anne Cairns, the Vice Chair of Mastercard, thank you very much for kicking off this morning. It's been absolutely fascinating and forced us to think structurally about what's happening in the payment system and banking, fairness and the changes at the very tops of our businesses. It's really been enlightening listening to you. So thank you very much indeed.